This is an article by David Ellenson about the organ and how it's used back and forth as an argument, either pro having an organ, the idea that there was an organ in the shul in Prague, maybe even in two different shuls, by the way. Maybe it sounds like actually in the Maral's shul, the Altna shul, that there was an organ for a certain amount of time. I mean, the main shul that's quoted as having an organ is different shul, not the Altna shul, but the which one we'll see. But so Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, so obviously it gets used both ways. Pro having an organ, not having an organ. The Chassam Sofer says, that there was an organ, but then they did tshuva and stopped using it after it broke. And or the opinion that we saw yesterday that maybe that shul had been around from before Christianity. For 2000, from the time of Bayit Sheni, from the Second Temple period, that shul had been around. And so when the organ was installed in that shul, it wasn't an imitation of the non-Jew. Or maybe actually musical instruments were used by polytheists. That becomes a different issue. So how you view what was happening in Prague in the 1600s is important. And so he quotes Melamed Hoel. A lot of what he says is based on the tshuva that we're doing. And other things that we've actually looked at already. But he has a couple of pictures that I want to show you. He also quotes from, there's a couple of letters that he highlights from Eile Divrei HaBrit, book that we looked at from Hamburg Bezdin that was written in 1819 against the early reform. But the early reform is making the argument that it makes a lot of sense to have an organ because that brings honor to the shul, brings honor to prayer. Obviously, the Orthodox argument is, no, this is an imitation of the non-Jew. So where you draw that line is not so easy. But this is you may have to turn your computer. But so this is an etching, obviously, a procession of Prague Jews in 1716, marking the birth of Prince Leopold. It's the birthday of Prince Leopold, I guess. Successor, or maybe it was his actual day that he was born, successor to the throne under number 19 in the illustration. You can see people, you see a portable organ. By the way, it turns out that it could be in these shuls that were portable organs. So 19 is there. Okay, you can see this guy holding something, and apparently that's a portable organ. That apparently this is a portable organ. Now it's interesting. Remember, we saw in that tshuva, I think it was the Mata. I don't remember which tshuva it was. There was one tshuva we saw that said, Orthodox Jews in Prague, Orthodox Jews generally, are going to want to use an organ. And it didn't say so much for like davening or Shabbos. It said for the birthday of the king, and for I think Simchas Torah. Was that it? Yeah. So that's interesting. The birthday of the king was a very big deal, obviously, and I mean you see here that there was this big procession. Now this doesn't really tell you much because you could easily argue that having an organ in a shul is an imitation of their ways, whereas having an organ at a march for King Leopold is not. That doesn't seem so. This is an etching. And it's from the Jewish Museum in Prague. It's an engraving of the old synagogue in Prague, the Alt Shul. So I assume that's not right. The Maral Shul is called the Alt Nu Shul, the old New Shul, and this is the old Shul. So this may be the one that they're always talking about, and supposedly you can see an organ here, which I guess is this, maybe? Are those organ pipes? The left middle. A little bit hard to make out. But anyway, I just wanted to show you those. So the so this obviously is the big question. This right, that the mom of the Hoel that Rabbi Dovtzei is dealing with right now is, how do we understand the organ in Prague, and is it precedent for permitting? Right, again, he's answering this rabbi who says, my people want an organ all the time. If I bargain them down to weekdays, is that okay? Can I stay there? So one by one, he's sort of going through the arguments. Was there an organ in the temple? Was there, and therefore it's not an imitation of the non-Jew. And he had concluded that he had sort of separated between weekday and Shabbos. And he had brought proofs both ways, that maybe it was similar to the instrument, not. And he said, he concluded there, that they did not use an organ in the base of Mikdash, in the temple. And even if they did, it doesn't matter, because it would be similar to a matzeva, right, in the time of our ancestors, they would build these piles of stones and monoliths, and that was permitted, obviously, but later on it became forbidden. We'll see a little bit more about that later. In other words, how does the culture that you're in, obviously that's going to impact in a very big way the question of not walking in their ways. What's considered their ways going to be very much time and culturally dependent. So here he was writing about the Argo in Prague, and the big question of how did they use it? Did they use it on Shabbos? Many argue that no, they stopped using it a half an hour before Shabbos, at the end of Lecha Dodi. That maybe, and he had cited this Sidur that was published in the 1600s that specifically said, here's a piyut, here's a poem that was done with the organ in the Prague shul. Now, remember, he had said it was, I tried very hard to find that siddur. He had said that siddur was bound to another book. And I found that other book, actually, a photocopy of that book in the in the Israeli library, in the Israeli National Library. And I'll show it to you. You. Interesting. So this is the book that he had quoted, the Sifsei Yeshanim, and this is it, and it's by Rabbi Shabtai Batz of Prague. So he lives in Prague, so he obviously knows what he's talking about, and it's interesting. He was like clearly a sort of scholar, not just a rabbi. And the whole book is, it's down through the ages, all the rabbis, books that have been published. It's basically a bibliography of Jewish publishing and Jewish manuscripts, actually. It's hundreds of pages. So he was obviously an enormous time. The problem is that the siddur is not appended to. Now, it sounded like it wasn't published with it, but it was bound to it. So it's not a surprise that necessarily the one that I found that doesn't have it. So I have not been successful finding that siddur, but I did try. But certainly the book that he quotes that it was bound to, that obviously exists. So now he's writing about the organ in Prague, and he mentioned that Siddur as a possible proof. On the other hand, other people who say no, that synagogue was built before Christianity, so it's no proof that it's okay to have an organ, or that they did build it, but then they stopped using it. Here's another possibility that they did have the organ in the shul in Prague, but he says maybe the nigun, the tune that they used, was a uniquely Jewish tune for that piyut, for the one right before Lachadadi, or for the rest of Kabbalat Shabbat that they did with an organ. If you say that they didn't use it on Shabbos Yan, and if you say that they had a Jewish tune for it, so theirs certainly sounded, if you had heard it, you would say, no, that's not an imitation of Christianity. You would say that's Jewish. Very hard for us to understand. It's just not at all. Maybe that's a possibility. And these changes of the tune would have rendered the playing of this organ that it would not be in the category of walking in the way of the non-Jew. So that seems like a very, to me, a slippery slope. If you say I'm doing it a little different than them, so it's not walking in their ways, where do you draw the line? He says, but really we should not rely on these ideas, these svarot, this what I'm saying here, in any other place. No, I think he's saying the same thing I'm saying, which is you can't just say this is different. But no, there's a difference in halacha. Oftentimes, when something was done, you want to find a justification for it, but it doesn't mean that it's precedent for going forward. For instance, there was a rabbi who wrote an article about 10 years ago, halachically arguing that covering your hair for a woman was not was in our society not necessary, even though the Gemara says a married woman should cover her hair. So everybody criticized him, and he said, "No, I wasn't writing it as precedent for the future, or trying to give people a leniency, because I was writing it to justify the actions of the Lithuanian rabbis' wives who didn't cover their hair in America when they came to America, which was true. There were, Rabbi Soloveitchik's wife, Ruderman's wife. There were very significant heads of Lithuanian yeshivas in America whose wives did not cover their hair for whatever reason. So sometimes in halacha there is a difference, right? Notice when he looks back at the Prague shul, he can say, well, okay, maybe it was because of this, maybe it was because of that. But that doesn't necessarily, we still have to see the current moment in our own halachic eyes. It doesn't necessarily change things for the future. Okay, now the next section is the question of using the organ, and is that an imitation of non-Jew? So he says, first of all, the first question is Christianity idolatry? And there's sort of two questions here. One is, does that mean not walking in the way of the non-Jew? Does that mean that it has to be an imitation of idolatry, and that's what's forbidden? Or is it just an imitation of non-Jewish culture and style? That would be one question. The second question is, what do you consider specifically trying to be like that, right? So Maram Shik, if you remember, had said it's if there's no good reason to do it. And obviously the only reason you're doing it is to be like them. But obviously we do all kinds of things like them. We cut our food the way they do, and we use the air conditioner the way they do, and we wear clothes like they do. That's not an imitation of the non-Jew. It looks like what the non-Jew does, but that's not why we're doing it. So he says the first question is Christianity idolatry? So that's a big question in halakha. Either maybe it's not idolatry, maybe it is idolatry. Most people think it is, or it's something in the middle called shitu. This is actually an important opinion, that it's idolatry for a Jew, but not for a non-Jew. Why? Because it's not really idolatry. It's not idolatry in the sense that this idol is God. Shita classically goes back to the Greek idea, the Zoroastrian idea, that there are two forces. is a force for bad and a force for good. And that the Godhead is a mixture. It's a combination of two forces, of two. There's two gods, but they're really one, right? Or there's three gods, but they're really one. There's three gods, but really one God. Is that polytheism or not? So obviously Christians would say no, that's not polytheism. And if you say to that, I told you this. I had a Lutheran colleague when I was at the university in St. Louis at WashU. It was in a very, mainline Protestant, trained, I think, at Harvard Divinity School. He was already in his 50s, 60s, a real thinker. And so I said to him, I said, John, how do you understand that Christianity is monotheism? What about the Trinity? He said, that's the mystery. In other words, it's not that different than it is for us, right? In other words, we have a sense of God being immanent, God being infinite. We have a sense of God being, we have a sense of God being male and female. So that's it's not that we, God forbid, think that God is not unified in one. If it takes on these things, and somehow it's all true. So that's shituf. Shituf is forbidden. So that's going to be part of the question. First, what's the definition of avodah zarah? What is idolatry? Secondly, does it even matter? Maybe imitating the non-Jew in their culture has nothing to do with idolatry. Maybe that's just a problem anyway. So he's going to deal with both of those. If you want, I can forward the elements. All right. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Thank you.